All right, hi, we're back. This is chapter 7, part 2, and we have some review questions. Uh, like I said, textbook question 3 and 4 are pertaining to chapter 7, so we're going to deal with textbook question 3. What can be done to increase voter turnout? I think you could make voting mandatory. I think you could do voting online. You could make it mandatory to have polling stations every, I don't know, every 5-10 blocks. Make sure there's no lines. You could do early voting, all kinds of ways to increase voter turnout. But obviously, the top notch would be to make it mandatory. You have to register for the draft, and you also have to register to vote, and then you actually have to vote. Question number 7 says, what purpose would the federal government violate state rights of election laws to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965? So number 7 says, what was the significance of the Voting Rights Act of 1965? What we know is after Reconstruction was finished, the white Redeemers took back the South. This was the election of 1877, 1876, Compromise of 1877, and the South put in literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses. And so I'm setting a timer so we don't go over that 15-minute threshold. Okay, so the Voting Rights Act was passed to outlaw the literacy test, the poll taxes, and the grandfather clauses. It was crystal clear that the federal government was going to have to step in to the terrain of states' rights in pertaining to elections because the literacy test, the poll taxes, and the grandfather clauses. And so that's why they did it. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it also allowed certain attorney general officials to go down to areas that tended to suppress the African American vote, like Mississippi and Alabama and such, and monitor those elections to make sure they're fair. The interesting part about that is we actually today go to other countries like South Africa or to Poland or whomever, and we monitor their elections to legitimize their elections to make sure they're fair. And that's what was happening back in the 60s. And remember that act was passed, the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 1965. It was to eliminate those voter suppression laws passed by states during and after Reconstruction, all the way through the Civil Rights Movement. What did it outlaw? It outlawed those literacy test, grandfather clauses, and poll taxes. How did they monitor state elections after this passage? They went down there and they made sure that they were having participants of all races and such. Number 8, how did the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 enhance the Voting Rights Act of 1965? This was trying to make it easy because what we've seen is you can raise voter participation if you make it easier for them to register. And so this was nicknamed the Motor Voter Registration Act. And that was because most states, to comply with this, were going to say, okay, when you come to register your car, when you come to get your driver's license, we're going to ask you, do you want to register to vote while you're here? Kill two birds with one stone kind of mentality. And I showed you that website that had states that still have, restrictive voter registration, and that is being dealt with under the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Take out racism. What voters do Republicans want, and what voters do Democrats want? So if you're looking at this and you're putting racism that exists in this country, obviously since the inception of the country, and you put racism out here on a shelf, like you could actually do that, right? But who do Republicans want? Republicans want the more involved voter, the one who's not just voting because that dude's name sounds cool or that guy is handsome. They want the one who's engaged in it and actually got a piece of the pie. They're vested in it. They're taxpayers. So that's their thought process outside of the racism elements of it. What voters do Democrats want? They tend to want all of the um, poor, and they want the inner city individuals to vote because they are going to give them more bolts to win elections, and they receive benefits in great quantities from the federal government. Because the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats is the Democrats want greater involvement by the federal government and the Republicans don't. And so that's like the big deal between them. And so if one party is going to be accused of voter suppression over another party, it's always going to be the Republican parties because of the nature of the belief system. Tell if the following increase or decrease chances of voting. Apathy, I don't care. Obviously, that's going to decrease. Higher education, that's going to increase. Fatigue, voter fatigue. I don't want to vote again. I got to wait in that 2-hour line. Forget it. That's decreasing. Same day voting only, obviously, that is going to decrease it. Early voting and absentee ballots, that's going to increase voter participation. Voter registration info has to match other government recorded info, like to a T, such as Kansas. That's going to decrease it. Long lines at polling stations decrease it. Polling stations outside of town and city limits, like Kansas was doing, that's going to decrease it. Mandatory voting, oh my gosh, that's going to increase it. White rich guy, he tends to vote a lot. A Baltimore African American activist, he tends to vote a lot. Latinos and Asian Americans, they tend not to vote as much. And so those are just some of the demographic differences. Demographic differences would be number 5, and then obviously, this would also help you with 9A and B. Okay, campaign finance laws. One thing to know about these PACs is that we have a history of the spoils system. And under the spoils system that basically started with, Andrew Jackson all the way up through the progressive era, you have the candidates choosing people for government jobs who help them get into office. And then they're asked to contribute to the campaign to keep these guys in office and to get them reelected. And so there was a lot of money flooding into politics under the spoils system. And we don't see that change until Buckley versus Valeo, 1976 case that ruled limits could not be placed on personal expenditures in elections. But then we see that change by 2002 in the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of McCain-Feingold. McCain was a Republican, Feingold was a Democrat. And they wanted to get the money out. They wanted to get the dark money out. They wanted to limit the amount that could be spent on a campaign, put spending caps on, presidential elections and even senatorial elections and such. But what happened was, under Citizens United, this is a case that went to the Supreme Court, and they ruled that this law was unconstitutional and that corporations could spend money, limitless amounts of money. And so that gives birth to the super PACs. And so the difference between the PACs and the super PACs, you can find basically at this video what is a super PAC. But it's passed and it's created after the Citizens United Supreme Court case. Because basically what it's saying is they can spend unlimited amounts, but the rule is that they cannot contribute directly to a candidate and they can't coordinate actions with the candidate. Another thing that the McCain-Feingold law did was it made the candidate actually own the advertisement. So that's why it says, this message is endorsed by George W. Bush. Like at the end, you'll see that. And so it did put some limits that you see still stand, even though this part with money was ruled unconstitutional. Anyway, that's number 10. And organizations created to raise and spend money to influence contributions to candidates and campaigns. After the Citizens United case, some rules still apply, but they can pretty much spend unlimited amounts. If you need that more explanation, you can find it on page 257 and 258. But it does go in and all the way back to like the spoil system, where candidates were choosing people who helped them get into office, and then in return, these people held office and they were supposed to contribute to the party and to the candidate to keep them in office. And we start to see laws passed to curtail that money in there. And this is the big one, the McCain-Feingold Act, that gets ruled unconstitutional and creates super PACs. Okay, and this just shows you an example of how much money is actually in politics. And so you can see that it's actually increasing since Citizens United. Okay, anyway, this is number 11. It says distinguish between a closed primary and an open primary, and what is a caucus. Basically, in a nomination process, we're trying to have, in a two-party system, your candidates chosen. And so primaries are how we do it today, and a closed primary would be like Maryland, where I used to live. You couldn't vote in another party's primary unless you were a registered member of that party. Virginia's not like that. Virginia actually has an open primary, as you can see right here, an open primary in Virginia. And that means if I'm a registered Republican, I could have voted in the Democratic primary and chosen Biden over Bernie or Bernie over Biden or whomever else was in the race. It doesn't matter. They're not going to ask me in Virginia what my party affiliation is. I don't have to be a registered Democrat to vote in the Democratic primary in an open primary system. A caucus, like we saw in Iowa, and several states have caucuses. And this is, like we said, this is number 11. There's 5 states with caucuses: Alaska, Hawaii, Idaho, Colorado, and Iowa. And instead of just going in and pulling a lever for a certain candidate, or shading in for a certain candidate, you actually go, and this is very time consuming, and it's a meeting, and you're sent to a room of whoever you're choosing. And then if your person doesn't get in a certain percentage, then you're kind of wooed over to a different size. And this process can take hours, and you have to be more of a committed party member in order for you to want to participate in this long, lengthy process. So very few states use the caucus system. Otherwise, it's just a primary, and in a primary, you're choosing the candidate for that party to run against the other party member. Okay, and then you have a national party convention in the summertime, and it used to be that the party convention is where they chose the candidates, but that created such dark horses, because they'd put a candidate up and somebody would find fault with him and say, no, you can't choose him, and put another candidate up, and you'd literally go through a list of like 20 people before finally everybody's like, all right, just chose him, because nobody knows anything about him, and that creates this dark horse that no one knows nothing about. All right, anyway, and so at the party convention, there's this confirmation of what the party stands for, and that's what the party platform is. And each issue in the party platform, so let's say the Republicans are anti-abortion, that's one plank being anti-abortion, or pro-Russia would be a plank, or universal health care would be a plank in the Democratic platform. And so just obviously, this is number 12. We're heading on to a different page. What is the purpose of the party platform? It's a cohesive list of issues with a stance, and each issue that makes up the platform is a plank. And so, for example, Republicans' plank on guns is pro-gun. Their plank on abortion is anti-abortion. Their, reversing Obamacare is a part of a plank. And all these different issues collectively together make up the platform. Okay. And that's pretty much what the two-party platform is, if you want to go into detail. But we'll get into the differences between the parties in another chapter. I like this cartoon, so I wanted to show it to you. And so the Republican platform for 2020: border security, booming economy, better trade deals, infrastructure, Democratic platform, everything about hate Trump, hate Trump, hate Trump. And so obviously you can tell. Anyway, this goes into the Electoral College. I might need to wait on this one because we might not have enough time. Yeah, I only have a minute and 45 seconds. So I want enough time to go into the Electoral College. So I'm going to need a part 3. I hope that that's going to be, maybe not. Maybe we're going to need 4 parts to this. Anyway, I hope that helps. I hope that review helped as well. And I'll come back with Chapter 7, Part 3 in just a minute. And we'll begin the Electoral College.